So now, welcome everyone to the American Literature Association Job Market Roundtable. I'm LuElla from the University of the Incarnate Word, and this is my first year organizing this with Monica Urban from the College of the Sequoias. And I have been on the Job Market Roundtable last year, and I've been sort of around. I've been to a few of the panels, and so I want to thank all of you for bearing with me this first year of organizing this roundtable. When I took it over from organizers who had done it for 5 years, I think. And then suddenly I'm organizing it during the year of the pandemic. So I appreciate all of you for this incredible service that you're doing for the American Literature Association. And I think, as I said when I emailed all of you, that this likely in the format that we're doing it will be something that really will pay it forward. Because when I've been in attendance to the roundtables and when I was on the roundtable last year, I remember it as one of the most sort of impactful experiences, both as an attendee and as someone who was on the roundtable itself. So thank you all for doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce you all as you are in the program itself. So we will go with Jason, Lewis, Maythee, C, and Monica. Dr. Jason Payton is an assistant professor of English at the University of Georgia, where he researches and teaches about early America and the Atlantic world. Dr. Luis Iglesias is an associate professor of English at the University of Southern Mississippi. He served as English department chair for 4 years and most recently as interim director of USM School of Humanities. And he is currently the vice president of the James Fenimore Cooper Society. Maythee Rojas is a professor of Chicano and Latino studies at California State University, Long Beach. Her research specializations include ethnic American literature and issues of gender and sexuality. She is the author of Women of Color and Feminism, which was from Seal Press since 2009. Her work has appeared in Feminist Teachers, Frontiers, Malice, Women's Studies Quarterly, Women's Studies, an Interdisciplinary Journal, and reference books such as Notable Women, Encyclopedia of Latino Popular Culture, and Latinas in the United States, Historical Encyclopedia. In 2010 to 2011, Dr. Rojas served as president of the National Association for Ethnic Studies and was the 2009 to 2010 interim editor for its journal, Ethnic Studies Review. She is currently the director of CSULB's Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Arts Degree Completion Program, which is a collaborative effort between the campus's College of Liberal Arts and the College for Continuing and Professional Education to assist non-traditional working adults in receiving their bachelor's degree. Dr. Rojas's most recent book project, which I am incredibly excited about after looking at it, Cultura Canine, is a cultural studies analysis that explores the physical and imagined bonds that US Latinos and the Latin Americans form with canines. In the process, the manuscript also addresses the socioeconomic and political factors that shape and surround many of these relationships. In particular, it considers how the dimensions of class impact views about Latino dog ownership, as well as the ways in which dogs and dog imagery can serve as vehicles for and commentaries about colonialization, immigration, and acculturation and transnationalism within US, Latino, and Latin American communities. C. Rosenow coordinates the honors program at Lane Community College in Eugene, Oregon, where she also teaches writing and literature. She co-authored the book Care Ethics and Poetry with Maurice Hamilton, and her book Leonard D. Moore in Haiku is forthcoming in 2022. She is also the senior editor of Juxtapositions, the Journal of Haiku Research and Scholarship. And finally, Monica Urban is an assistant professor at the College of the Sequoias. Prior to this, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas. While there, in addition to training graduate students on the teaching of literature, she earned grants for her digital humanities and service learning projects and helped to pilot the new online literature minor. She received her PhD in English from the University of Miami in 2016 and her BA in Women's Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her teaching and research focus on 19th and early 20th century American literature with special interest in gender, race, and material culture. And what we'll do is we'll go in order as I've just read your biographies, and as I requested, just 5 to 10 minutes of you giving your best gems of advice to those on the job market, and then we'll have a conversation together. So Jason, I hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, LuElla, for putting this together. I think this is a really important time and this is really important work. So thank you for your leadership there. And I want to say thank you as well to everyone on the roundtable for the time and energy that you're putting into mentoring job seekers. Again, I think this is really critical work. I think that's a conviction we share together. So I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have. And I also want to thank the audience who may be tuning in now or maybe tuning in later, however you may be tuning in, just for engaging with and investing in this panel and the conversation that we're about to have. So I'll start just by giving a little bit of my personal background and relevant experience with regard to job market stuff and search committee stuff, just kind of my recent career trajectory, so you know the position from which I'm speaking. So I took my PhD from the University of Maryland in 2012, and then in 2013, I took my first job, which was at Sam Houston State University. And this was a research comprehensive school with a 3-3 load and tenure and promotion guidelines that included either a monograph or a series of articles. And then in 2018, I took my second job here at the University of Georgia. And this is a 2-2 load, a Research 1 university with a monograph expected for tenure and promotion. So I have some recent experience getting a job. And I also have a very recent experience on search committee work. So we just served or just finished up a search committee hiring 2 positions for our composition faculty. Just wrapped up that work in the last week and a half, as a matter of fact. So a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about are fresh on my mind. What I want to do in terms of offering remarks to job seekers is I want to focus on practical strategies that job seekers can use to navigate various stages of the application and interview process. So I'm going to start by articulating 3 broad philosophical principles that help me in my own job search. And then I'll offer just a couple of bullet points that you can use kind of strategically at 4 key steps in the job interview process: the application, the screening interview, the campus visit, and the job talk. And then I can elaborate on some of these bullet points later in conversation. But I'll just kind of move through them in a summary fashion for expediency. So just philosophically, I think it's really important to know why you do the work you do and what you value about it. Kind of an existential question. I also think it's important to know your scholarly identity and be able to explain it cogently. Lastly, on the philosophical level, I think it's important to know what you can control and what you can't control in the application process, and to focus your energies on what you can control. So from that kind of like broad philosophical overview, let me just speak to these 4 stages of the application process and just give a couple of pointers, if I could, about each one. So the general application, I would really encourage job seekers to prepare distinct dossiers for research and teaching positions, and this includes your letters, as well as your letters of reference, as well as your cover letter and your other materials. I'd also encourage job seekers to work really hard to make their qualifications for the position advertised as legible in the letter and CV as possible. So just at the general application stage. When it comes to the initial screening interview, whether this is at MLA or Zoom, or wherever that is, it's important to prepare and rehearse concise answers to common questions about research and teaching. So there's a relatively short list of predictable questions you'll get, and you want to have 30 to 45 second answers that you can deliver cold at a moment's notice. I think that's helpful. I think it's also helpful to consider what these answers are doing in the context of a screening interview. So I like to think of using answers to questions in this context as an opportunity to tell a story about myself, how I see the field, how I view my role as a researcher and a teacher. And lastly, with regard to this kind of initial screening interview, I think it's important to use your teaching persona because you're speaking to a room full of intelligent, interested non-specialists whom you'll be educating about yourself and your work. So that's just some stuff on the initial screening interview. The campus visit, it was really helpful for me to be reminded that this is largely about people wanting to know who you're going to be as a colleague. So by the time you get there, you know, everyone knows your work is interesting and they think you're brilliant, but what are you going to be like to work with? So I think that's important to keep in the front of your mind. And it's important to think fit, know the institution and your hosts, know their values and their work, find and articulate connections. So think fit, and also think vibe. Put your enthusiasm on display, because again, what you gain from the campus visit that maybe you don't gain from some of these other interview stages is just like, who are you going to be when you're working in the hallway, on committees, you know, that sort of thing. So kind of generally speaking, those are my top tips for the campus visit. And then the job talk, I'll kind of end here. But my 3 points on the job talk are, again, to use your teaching persona. You're talking to a room full of highly intelligent, highly interested, highly invested non-specialists. So use your teaching persona. And then also use the job talk to show how you approach the field, so method, and to show what your method allows you to do creatively with your archive. So thinking at multiple levels about the work that a job talk does, I think that's a useful strategy. And then the last thing I'll say on the job talk is to think about the Q&A as an opportunity to showcase your creativity, adaptability, and generosity. So rather than kind of thinking about all the questions that could get asked and whether you will or won't know the answers, I think it's best to think about dispositions that you can put on display during that moment. So those are just in really broad strokes some of the most helpful things that I think I might offer current job seekers from my own experience.
Thank you so much, Jason. Louis?
Thank you. Thanks again to everyone for participating. Thank you, LuElla, for the invitation and for organizing this panel. Sort of following up on Jason's point, I'll just briefly say that I actually became an academic through a circuitous route. I spent 15 years working in human resources in a completely different field. And then I decided to go to grad school, and and here I am. And in part because of that experience, I very quickly moved up and moved into administration. So in fact, I have a lot of experience both as undergraduate director, as chair, as then interim director of a school, and I've been part of searches and hiring, and in fact making job offers across the humanities because of the School of Humanities structure. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit, in fact, focus my talk, given that I assumed a lot of people would talk about research, to actually really talk more about teaching. I think it's an important part of the job preparation process, which tends to focus a lot on your research. But I want to underscore the importance of presenting yourself as an effective teacher and the ways that focusing on teaching are critical to a successful job search. I have found over the years, whether leading search committees or as chair of the English department, that very strong candidates often find the teaching-focused aspects of the interview or the campus visit as the most challenging. It is perhaps not really an overstatement to say that more often than not, your research, as Jason already pointed out, gets you the interview, but it's the teaching that usually gets you the job. And there's two reasons for this, right? Research is mostly a private and singular matter. It is what you do, and it is the results of that that are evaluated and celebrated. However, teaching is a collaborative process, right, which happens in real time in front of an audience who is directly affected by your research and by your teaching skills. And more specifically, with respect to the job process, it is through conversations on teaching that you'll be able to insert yourself into the position, because the focus is very directly on what you will be doing in that position as it directly affects students, the department, and the institution. So regardless of the position, the program, or the school you're teaching at, a Research One university values teaching just as much as a teaching-focused college. And it is the reality of higher ed today that even though job ads may not necessarily stress this, this is really the truth of what is happening across the board. So how do you make teaching work for you in the job market? Well, when you apply for the job, usually job ads will frequently ask for a statement of teaching philosophy. These are, in my opinion, only marginally effective. For the most part, they tend to be generic statements, which honestly are not very different from each other usually. No one says, I lecture and I make students take notes. In fact, what we tend to write is, I use active learning, I foster open discussions, I engage in collaborative work, use digital resources, et cetera, et cetera. This is all very important and necessary, but an effective teaching philosophy says less about this and more about what you actually do to make these teaching practices and philosophies happen in the classroom in real time. Don't say that you engage in active learning. Instead, describe an actual assignment. Spell out the learning outcomes and the learning objectives. Make the teaching philosophy a statement of teaching practice, a goal where the goal here is not just to state an approach towards teaching, but rather to allow the reader of your materials to see you as a teacher, as you act out on your teaching. Grant them direct access to what you do and are like in the classroom and what you engage with when teaching. Even if you have limited teaching experience, if we're talking to somebody, a brand new minted PhD, you know, as the applicant, what works. You've had lots of classes yourselves. So take the time and reflect and think about your experiences as a teacher. And then think about what were the strongest learning experiences you had. Then think about and describe why those experiences worked. So you get an interview. Prepare by identifying 2 or 3 actual courses from the school's catalog that you would be teaching based on your expertise in your job ad. If the program has an undergraduate and graduate program, identify a course in each one of those levels. Then frame your teaching discussion during the interview in terms of those courses. Don't just say that you could teach a course in Latino literature. Instead, say that you would teach English 419, Survey of Ethnic Literature, Hybridity and Contemporary Latinx Writing. The effect of this is that it shows that you've done your homework and that you understand the specific needs. This is not just some generic course. And that it allows the interviewer to imagine you actually teaching one of their courses. You want to place yourself in the program and the department and let them know and think about you as already part of the department. Then, as you discuss this course for English 419, have 2 or 3 specific texts in mind. You don't need and you don't want to outline and describe a whole syllabus. You don't have time for that. But instead discuss a couple of works and a couple of sentences that highlight why these texts are important to the class and how you would frame them as part of your course, English 419. The point of doing this is you demonstrate how you think about the course. You rationalize your choices as you make them, and you present a unique perspective, the unique perspective that only you bring to this course. Allow the interviewers at this point to follow up with questions, and at that point, bring in an assignment that you would use in that class or cite additional texts. Here, less is more, specifically if you present it in a focused and thoughtful way. After the interview, when you send an email thanking the interviewers for their time and attention, send along a syllabus from the class you just discussed. The syllabus doesn't have to have a lot of detail, just a fuller reading list, some thoughts about the order and the learning objectives. This will show that you've been thinking about this class and that you are excited about teaching it for them. So now you get a campus visit, and hopefully those will happen again pretty soon. You may be asked to do a teaching demo. These can be challenging because they tend to be awkward. You will be walking into someone else's class and teaching students who will be polite, but who essentially won't know how to react to this person showing up. Don't take this personally. Don't perform your anxiety, but rather perform your excitement about teaching. Ultimately, this is what the interviewers are looking for. Less about content and more about teaching enthusiasm and self-presentation. Find out what was taught just before your teaching demo takes place and start your demo as a continuation of what happened in the previous class. This will give the students an immediate way to relate to what you're presenting because they'll already be familiar with what their professor had already discussed. Regardless of whether you're asked to do a teaching demo, discussions of teaching will come up during your job talk, during your interview with the chair, and with the search committee. You'll want to build on what you did during that interview This time, you'll have more time to research the institution more specifically. You'll be able to get a better sense of the course offerings, and you'll have an appreciation for the student body as well as for your colleagues. Throughout, discuss in specific ways the courses that you could teach, 2 or 3, no more, citing again specific course numbers and titles, and cite 2 or 3 texts that you would include in this class. You should cite a range of texts that include canonical works as well as works that reflect diversity. You want to show your range as well as your flexibility. Overall, you want to project yourself as someone who's already ready to teach there. Do this in a humble and respectful way. Don't be presumptuous, but show that this is something that you're prepared to do immediately. The important thing is to show that you are prepared for the classroom, that you'll hit the ground running the minute you show up in August. You want to show that you fit into the program's teaching needs, that you bring a set of teaching skills that the program seeks. This is why they're hiring in the first place. You want to give your interviewers a sense of who you are, allowing them to imagine you in that classroom. In all the successful hires I've been a part of, the common statement made during the meeting where the person is selected for the job offer is people will say, I can see him teaching that class. I can imagine him in front of students. If you can get that impression across, then you're making teaching work for you on the job search. Show that you are enthusiastic about teaching, that you understand that teaching is how you share your research and manifest your passion for the subject, and that teaching becomes a way for you to make a contribution to the day-to-day lives of your students, and by extension, to the lives of the department, the program, and the institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Maythee?
Hi, folks. Well, thank you to the audience that hopefully joins us, as well as to these wonderful panelists. To be honest, I feel like everything's been given in some ways in these 2 presentations. There's just so much information that's so wonderful, and I encourage everyone to take really wonderful notes on these past comments, because they're right on track. I think given kind of where the discussion's going, I'm going to focus more on the teaching aspect and kind of maybe go a little deeper into that. I am at a teaching institution, California State University system. It's an interesting system in the fact that in recent decades, it's become more expected that research is a part of our agenda, very much so, and publications are required. They depend from Cal State to Cal State, but generally it's a monograph, as Jason pointed out, or a series of articles. And where they're published also does matter to some degree. Or it does matter, but I wouldn't put it at the same level as, say, like a Research One university where, you know, there's a lot more discrimination. But teaching really is an essential, and it is, and for many of the reasons that Luis emphasized, it really is about building a department. And it's really important for the candidate to understand that the reason that position is being offered is because there's either a gap or a need that exists that's been identified and supported all the way from the department level up to the provost, right, who has allowed the position to go forward. Or you have a retirement that's about to happen or that has happened, right? That's opened that space up. So it's really about you fitting into that department through that position. And so equally, as Luis said, the research is going to be important in terms of that committee and the overall faculty believing that this person will make it through tenure, you know, without issue. But it's more so about then how will they fit in? What will they be able to grow within the department? And in particular, how will they be able to mentor students, attract new students, build the offerings for the students to come, right? It's really about that role that we have to consider that in many cases, faculty stay on 20 years, right? So it's when we're bringing our faculty in, we're really sort of which is very different from, you know, any other profession, right? Looking at someone that's largely going to stay there possibly their whole life, you know, or whole professional life, I should say, right? So we really do think about collegiality and mentorship and how that's going to take place. So when I'll focus mostly on then what happens when you come on site, right? When you come to the campus, or if we end up doing more of this, because I'm not sure if it's all going to go away, the sort of online portion of it, that, what is it that has to happen in that teaching presentation, which again, I'll agree with my colleagues, is often the make or break. In fact, I think most of the time, the make or break, which is surprising, right? Because we are sort of pushed so often to focus on how we present ourselves as scholars. But it does come down to, is this going to be a practical choice? And so one thing I always try to emphasize when I mentor students is go in with a rounded lesson. You want to have buy-in and takeaway for those students. You have to bring them in early, right? And as Luis said, a lot of times that, they're going to be open to you, but they don't really know you and they don't know what to expect. So you have to catch them early. And not in a gimmicky way, but in a way that's open enough for everyone to join. So really thinking about the kinds of questions that are open-ended enough to buy an interest. And then really key, have one major concept. Maybe, some side concepts is certainly helpful, but one major concept that you can deconstruct, provide examples for, get the students to interrogate and come to their own conclusions about, and then that's their takeaway, that they can leave with something that's truly been learned, and that allows the door to remain open for that to then be added on to another lesson. I think Luis also mentioned this idea that you want to sort of reference what's happened before your lesson, in this scenario where you're coming in, usually oftentimes I think it's like the third week that you're told to teach, right? So what's happened before those weeks 1 and 2, and then what can the students expect and that you are building on in this week, in weeks 4 through whatever, right? So really kind of think about how you're inserting yourself, and you want to remind students about key vocabulary. You want to sort of build this concept into previous ones, and give them a preview into what's to come. That's also really intellectual, because it allows the faculty that are observing you to see what your overall framework is of really impart the field, right? Because you're teaching to the field that you're claiming to be an expert in, and also more pragmatically the development of a course, its outcomes, what the expectations are for that course. So all of these things I think are really significant. So that I can't stress enough this idea of like the roundedness, like you come in, I think sometimes graduate students are so eager to, I should say, as they're graduating, right, and going into the field, so eager to show off everything they know that they overstuff. And I've been on a number of search committees, and like Jason, I just finished either being in a committee or being faculty that then obviously was invested and consulted with the committee, 3 different hires. So we had a lot of candidates we looked at. And one of the, I think, stumbling blocks for some was the overstuffing, the having to show it all, right? And you don't, we don't, right? That's not really the case, but it is showing what you know really well, so small, but in depth, that's to me really key. I think another aspect that I wanted to emphasize was being able to make distinctions when you're asked then about teaching, between teaching lower division and upper division and graduate students. Sometimes I think you want to have this egalitarian approach of like, oh, I teach all students the same. That's just not true. Not all students learn the same. You have to take into mind, how do students that are taking a general education course respond? How do students, what do students expect in an upper division or in a graduate course, right? Like it really is very catered to that audience. And it's important for an instructor to be able to describe that. I remember one time that being really a deciding choice in terms of how, we were looking at candidates. Like, could they teach lower division students and lure them in? And then what could they do to mentor our graduating seniors to get them into graduate programs or, other types of professional schools? And so it's always really, for us, one question that comes up very commonly is, how are the students going to respond? Will the students like this individual? Will she or he be able to start new initiatives within the department with those students? One thing is, we want to be our department always wants to be the home for these specializations. We don't want students to go elsewhere for it. So we want to hire people that are going to bring that in. And certainly personality is a part of it, but it's also that genuine interest and that that comfortableness with the topic. You know, I think those are all really key aspects. See, I took mostly notes. Let's see, something else I wanted to add. Oh, you know, I do, effective assessment, I think is another one. I think, Luis, you kind of maybe were hinting at that in terms of how are you going to be able to make certain that students walk away with those, you know, have those takeaways, have those outcomes that have become very essential, I think, in higher learning. So effective assessment it's a methodology that's become very prevalent in recent years, but not just saying it, but showing it, you know, through these examples that you do in the class. With the syllabi, you know, another interesting thing with that, sometimes I think syllabi are great to like provide a couple of sample syllabi, but make it, if you do two, for example, if you send a couple, send one of a course that exists that you can tell that this position is going to be expected to teach. And then go back to your research, whatever you're presenting scholarly in a scholarly way, that should obviously translate into a possible course in some way or another. So you want to have, if you're going to show an example of how that would be done. And again, it doesn't have to be super structured, but it has to be concrete. I found that sometimes, again, they were overstuffed when we would get these examples of everyone that people expected were expected to know. Well, that's not really what's going to happen in a classroom. Students cannot read that much. So again, less is more. I think that's my overall message here. Less is more, and to go deep with it and be genuine. And I think I'll end with that. To go back to Jason's point about fit and vibe, I know it's a cliche at this point, but I really believe in it, that you are interviewing them as much as you're being interviewed. You don't want to be miserable. You know, you really don't. I mean, again, could be a very long marriage, right? Like, so you want to really enjoy it. And I know that I say that as someone, you know, in a privileged position of being tenured and so forth. So I'm very sensitive to that. But ultimately, you do want to really feel comfortable where you are ultimately going to land. So you really have to keep all of those in mind, because sometimes, and I know having been on the job market at various points myself, that you know, you're thinking so much about what you're presenting out, but you have to sort of be calm enough to take what's coming back at you and to think about that. So I think I'll end there, and then we can talk about later with other things that relate. Thank you.
Thank you, Maythee. C?
Great, thanks. Thanks, LuElla, for including me today. I appreciate that. And thanks to everyone hopefully tuning in to hear our presentations. I am speaking specifically from the position of being on hiring committees at a community college. And that process is a little bit different than it is at other schools. So for example, we don't do screening interviews at a conference. We get the applications, we assign points to the different qualifications that we're looking for. And then the top 3 candidates are brought to campus, where they meet with the committee for an interview. They're given the questions they'll be asked in the interview about an hour ahead of time so that they can prepare. And then there's a teaching demo and a writing prompt that follows that. And so what I want to focus on right now is, how do you get to that campus visit? Because there are going to be a couple hundred applications that come in. And if only 3 people are moving forward, you know, how do you get there? And this is going to be pretty practical, pretty basic information. But I was surprised this past year we hired, and the number of applications that were thrown out because they weren't complete or they didn't meet all the qualifications was really astounding to me. It just, especially remembering being on the job market, it was kind of heartbreaking to watch that many people lose that opportunity. So the first thing that I would recommend is that you provide all the information that's asked for, even if it feels redundant. So fill out the application completely. If the application includes teaching history and it's already on your CV, type it in again, because for our college, any application with missing information is considered incomplete, and that application is thrown out. and the hiring committee never gets a chance to evaluate it. The second thing I'd say is make sure your application materials provide the information, and I think others have said this. I know Jason, you I think spoke to this, but make sure that that information is easy for the committee to see and to find. And I would say list it every place you possibly can, because you have a group of very tired people who are looking at a lot of materials. And so, you know, list things on the application, on your CV, in your cover letter. If it's appropriate, put it in your teaching philosophy statement, etc. And I can give an example. You know, our recent position, we were looking for a writing specialist with some experience teaching literature. We were also hoping that this person would have at least a little bit of experience teaching technical writing. It's not a common package, right? And so we're looking through materials, and you know, it was just by luck sometimes that you might see a candidate had some grad teaching experience or coursework in teaching technical writing, but the only place that was showing up was on the transcript. It wasn't called out in the cover letter, and that's easy to miss. And it's not weighted as heavily as some of the other qualifications, but those couple of points did move some candidates farther up in the ranking. So I think it's really important that you make your qualifications visible. And then the third thing I would say is to make sure that the overall package sends the message that this is the job you really want. This is the institution where you really want to be. And I know for a community college, we really want to see that somebody wants to be at a community college. It's tempting, I think, because of the limited number of jobs available, to go for mass coverage and to just put together those materials and send them every place. But if you are going to apply, at least for a two-year school, and I think this is true for other schools as well, that you take the time to tailor the materials to that type of institution. And I appreciate that that is challenging, because it's a lot of work and you're doing other things at the same time, and it's very stressful, but you really want to send that message that this is where you want to be. And I can give an example in this recent application round where the one candidate's statement of teaching philosophy ended with the statement, "My dream job is to teach at a Catholic university." And I just felt for that person, because I knew they had added that for the Catholic universities they were applying to and had forgotten to take it off. But it really signaled to our whole committee that this just wasn't a job they wanted. It was a backup plan. And that's not, you want to hire people who want to be your colleague. They want to be there working with your students, and you're not part of a backup plan. The other thing I would say, as far as sending that message, is create a CV that's specifically for two-year colleges. And you know, Monica, I'll be interested to hear your take on this. I don't know if this is the same across all two-year schools, but you know, our positions are pretty much for writing faculty who also teach some literature. And so if you want to lead with the description of your dissertation on your CV, that's okay, especially if that dissertation happened to be in Comp and Ret, but don't follow it with publications and conferences. Follow it with teaching experience, or lead with teaching experience. And then you have an opportunity later on the CV to show that, yes, you have this strong background in literature and you can bring that to the college, bring it to your teaching. Members on our last committee really felt that CVs and applications in general that emphasized literature, and especially literature publications, that those candidates really wanted to be at a research institution and didn't want to be at a teaching school or at a two-year teaching school. So yeah, for now, I can talk more about other parts of the campus visit later, but for now, I would just say, give the information that's asked for, put it everywhere you possibly can in the application package, and make sure that that package says this is really where you want to be teaching.
Thank you, C. And last but not least, Monica.
Thanks so much. I did kind of edit my notes, so I'll try not to repeat all the great advice that's come before. And yes, I did teach at a large state school, and now I'm at a California community college, but I did have a lot of interviews and campus visits at a wide range of institutions. So the first part of what I'll go through has to do with kind of general preparation and interview tips and some sample questions that I have from interviews that I've been a part of. And then I'll move on to the community college specific advice and add a little bit to what C had presented. As many people had suggested, yes, job market materials are very time consuming. They can take months to craft, but if you can, definitely get somebody to look over your materials. I know faculty are overworked and you might not have a job placement officer if you're still in grad school, but I found this to be a really important step to have at least 1 or 2 people at least evaluate that cover letter and CV. It's a really awkward genre to write and revise them as carefully as you can. As Luis had said, definitely find ways for them to imagine you in the classroom. You want specific examples. You want to avoid kind of general terms like student-centered. And for sure, you're going to want to tailor your letters in terms of the job ad. You're going to try to close read what they're looking for, but also for those of you that have been on search committees, it could be these dream desires of 7 or 8 people. And they might not actually hire a person that explicitly fits what they asked for in the job ad. It's just kind of an it factor that we really can't identify. But I think across all of the schools, you definitely want to emphasize what can you bring to the school? Can you host workshops for faculty? Can you bring speakers to campus? Will you start a book club? Will you be a faculty advisor? I have found that in my interviews, service experience came up a lot, which is hard to get if you're a grad student, but if you are in maybe your first position out of grad school, be prepared to present ways that you were involved in service and what you can bring to the new department. And we all know, for example, that English majors are declining rapidly. So think of ways that you can bring more English majors and potential majors to the department. As far as where to apply, definitely look for generalist positions if you can. Don't ignore visiting positions. That's what I was in at University of Houston. And before the whole pandemic, it was going to turn into a permanent position. Sometimes a friend of ours that teaches somewhere else in Texas, her visiting position turned into a tenure position. And in California, for the community colleges, they do hire from their adjunct pool, which I know is not common for 4 years, but I really appreciate that they are hiring from their current adjuncts, at least at community colleges. Of course, many of us have to move a new city or a new state. And I found that I probably misjudged some cities that I applied to thinking they were going to fall into a certain stereotype, but I think our perception of a particular state or region can be really off. However, on the other hand, don't feel afraid to pull out of a search. For example, I was a finalist where I adored the search committee. I really liked the school and the students, but I didn't think I could handle the climate. I've always lived in pretty warm areas and I just didn't think I could handle the winters there. So I ended up pulling out before the campus visit. And same thing, I would say really value your time and earn a good income. I know that's not necessarily what drew us to this position, but I think we work long hours. And if you find somewhere that maybe isn't offering or they're not able to offer you what you need to survive or you need in retirement, don't be afraid to turn down a job. I turned down a job at a 4-year university and I'm so happy where I am at a community college. So interviews, I would say the most important thing for me was to do a bunch of mock interviews. I had some really great advisors that were willing to do Skype interviews with me or in-person interviews. I don't think we all realize what we sound like in interviews, and it's an uncomfortable process, but the more you do it, the better you get at it. You're gonna try to be professional, but personable. A lot of you all have said on this panel that the committee is definitely looking for a long-term colleague. But of course, spend time thinking about the types of students they serve, be specific. And then I kept a list of interview questions over the years. Then you can rehearse with these, but don't sound too rehearsed, of course. And then have questions ready for the search committee. For example, ask more about the students, find out what people like about living in that particular city or area. But you will have done your own research on the area, of course. Ask about ongoing or emerging diversity initiatives. Okay, so you're getting ready to put together your job materials for the fall. What can you do now? Keep revising the materials. In addition to all the work that everyone has to do as far as conferences and publishing and your own teaching, look for professional development opportunities, become a GLBT ally, read current scholarship on equity in the classroom, come up with more opportunities to work with undergrads on their research if you can. And then a few sample questions that came up pretty consistently, almost regardless of the type of institution. And again, I was probably interviewing more at small teaching-centered universities rather than R1s, but let's see. Most of them asked, how do you use technology in the classroom? How do you see equity and diversity as central to your teaching practice? And how is that reflected in your curriculum or course content? Almost every single school said, why do you want to work here? So you've got to have a great answer for that. What makes a good colleague? What role does faculty play in student success? How does your research inform your teaching? And describe one specific classroom activity that you've designed to address equity gaps and explain your rationale. And I think all these are really important questions. I think they're thoughtful, and the committees that I've interviewed with were very eager, I think, to hear the answers, and were, thoughtful teachers and researchers themselves. And then lastly, as far as California community colleges, and I'm speaking more specifically about California because we have a really strong union there, so that does affect a lot of our practices. And to add to what all the great advice that C had, there are more PhDs at community colleges, but that doesn't necessarily mean if you apply with a PhD that you're going to be put ahead of other candidates. Community colleges have a late job market process. Usually the ads don't go up until maybe March, and they might not be on MLA, so you might have to go to specific schools or community college job sites. And they're definitely mission-driven institutions, so you need to show them how you're going to commit to their goals, why it's important to you. This is absolutely not a fallback job. This is where you want to be. You want to work with these kinds of students, and you're excited about what they do at a community college. And then you need to be especially explicit about your commitment to diversity and what you have already done for diverse initiatives and how you're going to continue to do that at the school. And one thing I found that was interesting is that the applications did take a long time. And yes, you have to fill out that kind of beastly application box by box, but you also have to write 4 to 5 essays. In addition to the job market materials, they might have you mark up a sample paper. You might have to submit lesson plans and paper prompts. And then, as C said, the teaching demos are in the first round, and they're with live students, which is great. And then not all schools do reimburse for travel, but they do reimburse some. So you might have to plan that into your budget, that if you live far away from that school, you might have to pay for the hotel and airfare. And then just a final plug for community colleges. I've found the students to be hardworking and sincere, like we have at so many of our institutions. The pay is quite high for California. They have a strong union. If you do get hired, there's really no negotiating beyond where you're put on the salary schedule. So all the salary schedules are open access. You can look them up right now and kind of get a sense of what people are paid, but you can negotiate kind of where you're put on that schedule. We have, annual raises and cost of living raises. And yes, I teach a lot of composition, but surprisingly, I've taught literature almost every semester. And it's interesting too, that if you want to branch out and not just teach American Lit, you want to try Chicano Lit or Modern American Lit, there's nothing keeping anyone from teaching those classes except for seniority. So you can kind of branch out from your specialization. And the teaching load's a lot more manageable than I expected. They do pay for conferences. You can still publish. They have sabbaticals. They have overload hours. And it's really interesting how much I think shared governance is valued, perhaps more than I was expecting. Yeah, so they do take things like that very seriously. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. I am heartened by this conversation, which is, I think, been a long time coming to be heartened by a conversation after this past year. And I also want to, I want to say thank you specifically for each of you giving your authentic perspectives too. I spent a long time sort of considering who to invite to this particular job market roundtable, and I am so grateful to each of you. I do have a question to start us off, and then I'm going to open it, but I feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room that we've sort of I think not really touched on very much, and it's the pandemic. How do each of you think that the job market might, or I guess, how do you think job seekers might change the way that they approach the job market? How do you think that interviews might change based on the job market? Just knowing how this past year has gone, because I think that all of this advice is, well, I think all of this advice is good advice. I have a whole litany of things that I've written down of like good points. So I think all of it is very good. But how do you think that it might change, or how have your perspectives changed over this past year, based on how teaching has altered, since so many of you, I think, talked about teaching in particular? Or anything else. You don't have to just talk about teaching.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked about that, because the pandemic really informed the questions that we posed to the candidates. And one of the things we wanted to know was how had their teaching changed, or had it changed? And it was an opportunity to learn if candidates had sought out professional development, like what lengths did they go to try to adapt their teaching to the circumstances. For some people, they had already quite a lot of experience teaching online. Other people had gone remote, and this was the first time they'd done it. And so it gave you a shared experience to talk about with them, and also a chance to see, well, what does someone do when there's a new and very challenging situation that impacts their work?
And I'll just add to that usually these sorts of situations, any kind of major sort of national or global event, tends to exacerbate and speed up trends that are already happening. So what I think is interesting that has happened in the past, 14 months is, for example, flexibility of teaching platforms. So, usually, universities, would have sort of online learning over here, and then the predominant would be face-to-face or some other configuration. Now everyone has to be able to do everything. So, and that's not going to change. In fact, as it's already been brought up, the fact that English majors, humanities majors are declining, universities are trying to find ways to reach students where they are, and find ways to sort of find more adaptable ways of presenting those areas, those disciplines that we teach, and make them broader across a bigger range of students, right? So even though I teach at an R1 university, our student body really reaches out towards veterans. We reach out, a lot to, older non-traditional students who are seeking more kind of accreditation in terms of their own professional lives, but then find ways to connect that to the humanities. So flexibility, your demonstration of flexibility, your ability to think in these more flexible terms, I think are really important, and certainly a trend that's going to continue, and in fact only increase. And the only other thing I'll add to that is the other trend that I saw happening, which again speeded up, and C already mentioned this, is a lot of the interview process, the application process has become increasingly more technological, and a lot of the initial sorting, you don't go through 400 application, pieces of paper anymore, right? The committee already gets a pre-selected number of applications, because the system throws out incomplete applications, or systems might use keywords or look for specific things. So you're going to have to be, as C already pointed out, very meticulous and make sure that you've checked all the boxes and that you've presented yourself, as Monica says, in the broadest ways possible, because you don't know whether the HR system that they're using is keyed to certain keywords. And if you didn't happen to use that keyword, your application just immediately got put into a bin somewhere. So be flexible, broad, and thoughtful.
And if I could add just briefly to what C and Lewis have already said, I think obviously the pandemic has been full of so much tragedy and so much loss, but there's something I think that a job seeker who's taught or learned through the pandemic can bring to an interview out of the challenging nature of these times, and that is to demonstrate again the characteristic of adaptability and agility and the ability to respond to really trying circumstances in good cheer, in good faith and with great effort, because these are traits that, if you can show you possess them, they translate to a number of other scenarios that we can't see in the future, hopefully not pandemics, but things that you'll encounter as your department maybe changes shape or programs shrink or expand, or, you know what I mean? You have to have those characteristics. And so if you can tell a story about how you adapted your teaching or your learning, your communication or your assessment, your work with colleagues, your research on the fly in the midst of these circumstances, you can tell a committee something about the ways in which you possess these traits and are able to use them in high stress and high stakes situations. So I would maybe even encourage job seekers to just try to find a story about how they connected with a student, how they improved their classroom. And it's not all roses, but if you can seize on one or two of those stories maybe and find a way to tell them as a way of telling something about yourself, I think you can make something good of teaching and learning in the pandemic, just again to echo what C and Luis have already said.
I'll bring up a couple of challenges that I see moving forward. One is I think that there will, well, as I mentioned, I don't think Zoom is going away altogether. I think that departments will likely employ them for interviews. What used to be phone interviews, I think will pretty much be Zoom interviews now. So really thinking through how you come across will continue to be just as important. But there's also going to be some generation gaps. Oftentimes people who are on committees are full professors, are the older generation in that department. There'll be a mix in, but for example, in our university, assistant professors don't sit on committees because of the fact that they're not tenured yet, and for obvious personnel reasons, as well as their own need to focus on their work. So this generation gap, I think that may happen, means that the candidate has to take into account how to present their work in these various platforms, right? That is accessible to students today, but also not turn off those older generations that don't really believe altogether in this new form of platform, or this new platform, right? I see this as a challenge where the candidate really has to please two different groups and do so, in the most diplomatic way possible. Maybe not unfairly so, but I saw it come up where a comment by one colleague was like, oh, well, they used all these things because it's a Zoom format, but how would that really translate to the classroom? And that seemed unfair, but those are the kinds of things I think a candidate has to be prepared for. And then similarly, in terms of what they use, I think, again, I'm just going to keep going back to that model. I think doing something generally well, so not using too many different techniques, electronically, but using a few and then using them really effectively. I mean, again, showing why you're using them, not just because you know how, but because they actually bring something to the teaching and even the research, I think is really important. And then a last challenge I'll mention from the research end is one of the things I think we're finding is for any scholar that has used archives, is using needs to access materials that basically then were shut away, during the last year, there's going to be an impact there into what then they can produce for their, their dissertation, their research. So I think from our end, we need to be sensitive to then how that's going to impact, the candidates we're getting in terms of what they're able to show that they've gotten done and what their trajectories now have been sort of revised to, to look like.
So it seems as if we are saying to be organized, meticulous, adaptable, and then also cautious, right? At the same time, right? So now I'm going to mute myself. I have some more questions, but I am hoping now that we can simply have that conversation. So if there's anything that you noticed from any of the other panelists that you wanted to remark upon, talk about, and Alonso, if you have anything that you have to remark upon or join in on the conversation, feel free. So now we can just sort of talk. Which probably, like my classes, will like have a pause where everyone stares at each other blankly, and then we will talk.
Before my internet freaks out again, I wanted to bring up one question maybe for you all. I'm seeing a lot of people leaving academia on academic Twitter or Reddit. A lot of people, perhaps grad students or early career scholars, are frustrated with a lot of issues in academia and they're done. What do you all think about that? How can someone weigh the times they want to be on the market? I don't know if anyone has specific advice or has thought about this, but that's something I'm increasingly worried about, I guess.
Monica,
As somebody who's changed career, I'm sorry.
no, please, Luis.
No, as someone who's changed careers, I think changing and thinking about change is actually a positive thing. Often, we ask young people to make decisions about their lives and their careers, and then we put them on this path. I distinctly remember having a conversation when I went to grad school with another another member of my class, and I was showing her around New York, and I was telling her about my experience, and she's like, "Oh, well, let me tell you my experience. I babysat, and now I'm here." So this idea that people can change careers, I think, is actually a good thing, and I think in some ways the dynamics of academia right now is so, in some ways, volatile, but also very exciting because there are so many different opportunities now, right? The path is no longer very direct, right? And there's digital humanities, there's working, in terms of different kinds of advisement, student interaction, reaching out to different communities, issues like that. But I think it's important for, I think the best advice that we can give is to really think about what is it that draws you to academia, but also then to think about how does that connect to other areas, right? Are you, somebody who really wants to just be in an archive, and if that's where you want to be, then how do you start to position yourself and move your work, whether it's your research, your teaching, your service, in that direction, right? Are you interested in working with community outreach? How do you then use that experience that you're having as as a researcher or as a scholar, to do that? So I think while it is daunting and perhaps a little bit scary at times, if we turn that around and think about it as an opportunity to sort of think about what else is possible, this is like the perfect path for scholars, younger students, younger scholars, younger professors to reassess and to recreate themselves.
Yeah, Monica, I think it's such an excellent and productive question. And Luis, rather, I love what you said in response. And I was thinking when I phrased this initial question about like, why do you do the work you do and what do you value about it? I think that's the question. If you can answer it, that gives you clarity about whether or not pursuing an academic career in traditional terms is worth it in the current moment, with everything that's going on, with other opportunities that may be out there, with dwindling opportunities within academia, compensation, location. I think answering some of the core values questions can help people, I think, decide, do they want to invest fully or do they want to pursue something else? And so when I think about my own situation, I'm curious by nature, and I love to help people. Academia is an interesting place for someone like me, but it's not the only place for someone like me. And I think whatever, however job seekers might answer those questions for themselves about why they do what they do and what really motivates them, I think answering those questions can be liberating, because it can perhaps show you that there's a world of manifold opportunities for you to do things that would gratify you. Some of them may be in academia, some of them may not, and everyone has their own personal reasons for making the decision to invest or divest, from the kind of academic job search and the academic career track. But I think those core value, issues are really, really central.
Jason, I really appreciate the way you framed that, because I think there's a risk for people who've gone a certain distance with their academic work and then decide that's not the right fit, or they want to do something else. There's a risk that that can feel like failure. Right? When we're in that space where everyone around us is doing the same kind of work, is passionate, is competitive in many instances, and somebody decides, well, maybe this isn't my path. I think looking at your core values and saying, how can I recreate myself? What are the possibilities? This is about agency. This is about possibility. It's not about, I didn't get there or I didn't make it. It's, I'm taking a look at this. And I think, Monica, you brought this up. I mean, the economics of it. I was so thankful that you said something about that, if you're going to make huge sacrifices, make sure it's in service of something that really calls to you, or think about what does call and find your way there. That said, I also think, and Lucy, you mentioned this, there's a lot of possibility right now. There's a lot of potential. It may not be the potential that you planned on several years ago when you started on this path, but that doesn't mean it's not wonderful potential. And that once you are working someplace, what might change for you over that next decade, you can't foresee it yet. So yeah, I appreciate everyone's comments about this. I think it's a very important topic.
I'll just say, I forget who said the word liberation, and I think that's the best part of it. I felt like when I was going through graduate school, there was just such deep, deep anxiety, and this sense of scarcity, and feeling like, in addition to failure, that the waste, the debt, there was just it was so also negative in the sense that if we didn't get this job, we were ruined, right? Like in so many ways. And now, I mean, it does sort of show like entrepreneurship, has developed, right? Where people no longer are necessarily trying to buy into getting into this corporation or that, but are, sort of self-starting their own companies and really thinking in these new creative ways. And so the fact that our very, ivory tower, industry can actually also be accessible in those ways, like can, find new directions for people to take. That's great. I mean, that's so liberating, because then the pursuit of that degree is for like oneself and intellectual growth and personal development. And then perhaps will be applied to the university, but could be applied to so much more. That's fantastic. And it's something that my generation definitely did not have access to, and even now would feel a little scary if I were to look elsewhere. But that that these younger scholars can be freed from that. Wow, I mean, that makes me actually very happy.
Maybe I think you're kind of tapping into something that may, I wonder if or I feel as though my experience were the same. I sort of feel like when I was going through graduate school, I got taught that there was a single model of career success. If you're good at your job, it looks like this in the end. And of course, that just it doesn't work out. Most of the time. And I don't know that anyone ever said it explicitly, but it was sort of in the air. And I think perhaps, those of us who are in the profession now have an opportunity and even a responsibility to provide a more capacious view of what a fulfilling life could look like for our students with the skill set that we teach and the knowledge that we try to build together. So I think it's important to kind of move away from what seems like an older and perhaps unhealthy way of thinking about career success.
I have a question, but it's different from the question that was posed, LuElla. So yeah, I'm going to be graduating in next year. So all of you have been wonderful, but it's really terrifying, overwhelming for me. But I have two questions. So first of all, I'm not originally from this country, and so that's going to be one challenge. So my first question is going to be, as individuals who have invariably served on search committees, what is your advice in terms of when internationals are applying for a position, whether they tell you on the front end or on the back end that they're going to need like additional documentation, like a H-1B visa? You know, do you recommend that they reveal that information right away, or wait until there's some kind of a job offer? And then the second question, we have a placement officer here at Texas Christian University. And I remember there was a lot of pushback because when he said that in today's job market, service is not valued as much unless one can match one's research to the teaching. The university or the department is gonna get that service from you anyway. And so maybe service, you don't need to emphasize service on your CV. So, you know, what are your responses to those two questions? Thank you.
I'll start. The issue of international applicants is a touchy one. I mean, there are sort of legal issues involved. Now, as I'm sure most of the universities represented here are already using some kind of an electronic application process, and usually that question is asked, if not directly, somewhat obliquely. You know, so I'll ask a question like, "Will you be needing, some kind of support?" And check the box, or not check the box. And all I can say there is be very honest about checking the right box, because if you try to hedge your bets on that and then it comes up, that becomes an immediately disqualifier and actually leaves a very bad impression. And I'll be honest, I mean, again, and I can't speak for every institution, that process can be costly, and universities will be perhaps hesitant to invest in a costly process. So that is always runs a risk. But I think if you are honest and you are direct, and there again, the application needs to be as forward-thinking and as positive as possible, because at the end of the day, that just becomes a box that gets checked, as opposed to what they're really looking for is your unique skills, what you bring to the university. And if you're a candidate who is dynamic enough and doing what the kind of work that the university is looking for, and you're doing it in a very flexible, adaptive, and progressive way, then the university will say, sure, we'll invest in this individual and we will help them with their with their status, or with any kind of visa and so on. So I think that's really very important. And then very quickly, in terms of the service, I mean, yes, universities are going to get service out of you one way or the other. And I think another theme that's been coming up that I've noticed is that so much of the way you present yourself on the job market should be forward-looking. In other words, yes, you have some service in the background, but that's in the past. We're not hiring you for the past. We're hiring you for the future. So if there are ways that you can sort of translate the kind of work you've done, whether it's an interesting research project or your work on digital humanities or your work on, working with archives, and then imagine that, or, creative work, and then imagine that as service in the future, then I think that is how you can frame service in a way that is, not only appealing, but again, allows the interviewers to see you in the job, right? Oh, this is great. Here's somebody who could help us develop a kind of undergraduate critical journal or critical newsletter, something like that. So I think that's how service works the best, because as we said, and I think everybody said some version of this, you are a unique candidate and you want them to understand that you are a unique candidate, right? And that you can do something. So, basically you're saying, hire me because I can do something nobody else can, and that's how you want to frame it going forward into the future.
Yeah, I love that way of talking about it, Louis, and Alonso, to the question about how to frame your service. I'll kind of tell a story from my own kind of like job search experience. So when I went to Sam Houston State University, one of the things that was on the table was the potential creation of a Center for Transatlantic Studies. So it was something that the dean was invested in, and we had a number of faculty that were already there, my prospective future colleagues who were working transatlantically. And so this was a thing that didn't exist, but it'd be really interesting if they could get a candidate who might be able to contribute and grow something in that area, working together with other colleagues. I happen to work on piracy, the literary history of piracy in early America. So I do transatlantic stuff. And that was something that was really exciting to me. And so, in my own experience, I was able to say, well, this is not something I've built before, but these are my inclinations. These are my kind of research interests. I think there are natural affinities with people, person XYZ in this department and maybe in other departments. And I would look forward to contributing in these specific ways to maybe realizing a vision like this. I think that's a one way of saying, from my own personal experience, what is it that your unique capacities and interests would allow you to create in this new environment, in a collegial capacity, in the kind of realm of service. I think that's one way of thinking about it. I think it's, if I'm kind of picking up your drift, Louis, that's kind of where you're going as well. And I think that's a really great approach. I would also just kind of say really quickly, I think every personal interaction you have with someone during a visit and the interview process is telling them something about who you're going to be in service. So you can also kind of think about your interpersonal interactions as ways to communicate who you are as a colleague, because service is really a lot about collegiality as much as it is particular visions for particular initiatives. But you got to work with a bunch of different people with a bunch of different ideas and priorities, and can you do that? And so you can show at multiple points that you can.
Keep clicking the wrong button. The other thing I wanted to add to that, and you made me think of something that's really very important, is again this rapidly evolving academic environment. Interdisciplinarity is really important, right? Not just in your own research, but also just within the context of particular programs or the university. So to think about and sort of talk about, again, don't make up stuff, and certainly don't be somebody that you are not, because, at the end of the day, the whole interview process is about presenting the best version of yourself, not a version of someone else. But, any ways that you can talk about or imagine sort of interdisciplinary work, reaching out to other programs, other departments, other, constituencies, other stakeholders, whether that is in terms of service, like, you're in a traditional English department, but you want to develop a kind of humanities club, or do a kind of science fiction, science meets lit group, something like that. Any kind of moments like those, that is very appealing right now, and it is a way of thinking that is reflective of an evolving academic world, right? Where we're moving away from these sort of strict disciplinary titles and concepts, and we're moving more towards these more the word that Jason used, which is great, like a more capacious way of thinking about scholarship, teaching, and service.
Mm-hmm.
I might piggyback briefly. I want to make sure I gave some enough quiet space and time in case anyone was wanting to jump in. But I'll just again kind of play off of what Louis has said about, and this applies to your question directly, Alonso, but I think probably to questions that a lot of job seekers are asking about themselves. And that's the importance of knowing who you are, being true to who you are, representing yourself accurately and faithfully in your materials, and accepting that you can't be all things to all people at all places. So, increasingly job ads are generalist, or they places want you to wear many hats because we have to. But you are trained in a specific area, in a specific way. You may have some interdisciplinary interests. You may have some interdisciplinary kind of experiences in collaboration or in your scholarship or teaching, whatever. But, I'm an early Americanist. I'm not a modernist. I do have an identity as a scholar. There are things I do. There are things I do well. And then there are things that are just kind of beyond my reach or at the outer edge of my reach. And I think kind of coming to grips with who you are and providing a compelling account of who you really are and what you really do can be more effective than maybe trying to present yourself as someone who does all the things, because we know those people don't exist. So just kind of like figuring out how to tell the best, most compelling story about the things you do particularly well, the things you really care about. I think that can be empowering for job seekers. And of course, what that means is that you'll be a really great fit in some spots, and in other spots, you won't be the ideal fit, and that's okay. Yeah, just kind of an extension of the point I think you're already making, Louis, and I hope that does speak to your question as well, Alonso.
These points sort of remind me a little bit of what both Maythee and C were saying earlier. I think Maythee, you talked about how it's really important, right, to not try to overdo constantly, right? I remember that point. And also to remember that you have agency. Often, I think, especially probably at the point Alonso and many of those who will be viewing this later will feel, and I think all of us can feel as academics, right? The academic job market feels overwhelming. It can feel as if, right, it is everything. It becomes almost all of our identity, to the point that we feel as if we have to pretend we are everything. So when we're applying to a community college, we might say things erroneously like, oh, I wish that I were at a Catholic college, right? I'm not checking all of these boxes, right? And right, you feel that disingenuousness when you are looking at someone, that they don't want to be there, right? And if you don't want to be there, then perhaps, right, you're forgetting that you have this agency too, right? That there are all of these other types of jobs that you could be doing because you're someone who is at the level where you are finishing with your PhD. So you can do all of these other things, as Monica pointed out earlier. And I think it's important not to forget the rest of our identities. It's important to remember who we are, what our values are, who we are both as scholars, but even more importantly to that, I think who we are as people, right? Is it worth it to move to this part of the country, right? Is it worth it to make these particular sacrifices, and to really assess those things about ourselves as well, because that can often get lost in the mix. It certainly, I think, did for me often when I was on the job market, right? You sort of get overwhelmed with everything, but I think it's important to remember that agency, and I think that can make you and does make you a better job candidate, because feeling that authenticity, right, that I want to be here with you and I'm testing you out as well, that makes it feel as if there's a real interchange. Hopefully some of you will respond to that.
Well, I think that's 100% right. And in fact, I really appreciated Monica's point about, on the one hand, keep a very open geographic mind as well as a sort of institutional mind, in that, depending on where we, went to school or where you go to school, speaking to those who are viewing this, You may have or be given advice that has a kind of pretty generic or incestuous track. So, if you went to a kind of R1 school, chances are your professors are telling you that you need to apply to an R1 school. So to be thinking about that, and also geographically, I mean, I think this is a very big country with a lot of really interesting and exciting places. Everything from like major cities to smaller college towns. So don't prejudge. In fact, think about all the options that are available to you. Having said that, I personally drew a latitudinal line, and said, I'm not applying to any schools north of this line because I do not like cold weather, and I don't care how much they're paying me. So, to be really honest with yourself in terms of, what will make you miserable, doesn't matter what fantastic school is there or what offer you could potentially get. If you're going to be miserable, then it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter because, as Maythee said, and and Monica said, I mean, you have to live there and you have to be happy. So I think that kind of agency is really, really important. So it's finding that balance, right? Having a balance. And again, another theme that everybody seems to be touching on is being very, very realistic and being really honest about who you are and what you want, not only now, but in the future. But also, to be flexible, because in some ways you don't know what you want in the future, right? The future is really has so many great opportunities. So keep that balance as much as you can.
Yeah, LuElla, to your question, I'm heartened that this conversation has, taken or been, I suppose, had in such a philosophical spirit. So I was sort of like writing my notes, and I was thinking, this is like an existential question. I mean, like when I think about like job market and career satisfaction, success, I'm sort of like asking existential questions. Am I the only one who's doing that? But it sounds like, we're sort of all thinking in similar terms about what's worth it to us, what do we value, and how do we want to pursue it. And Monica, I think the story that you told about walking away from an opportunity that maybe somebody from the outside, a third party, may not have, they may have made a different assessment, or they may have had a judgment about, how could you turn down this opportunity for this other opportunity? Only the one that is right for you, and having the bravery and the courage to say, this situation might look great to someone else, but it doesn't look great to me, and it doesn't feel great to me. And I'm going to pursue this other thing that does look great and does feel great to me. I think that's really powerful. I don't think, at least in the conversations I have about job market stuff, I don't hear that story very often, but it's an important story. Perhaps we all have a version of to share where there's just a line in the sand, or a thing doesn't feel right. And so you have to put yourself first, given your knowledge of your own proclivities and values and interests in life. And so again, it's all very philosophical sounding and maybe ethereal and kind of existential, but it's crucial to making the right decision for you in your career. And so I'm just really glad that you told that story, because I think job seekers will benefit from hearing it. And LuElla, just, also again, I'm glad I'm not the only one who's thinking about this issue in such terms. Seems like we're all in a similar headspace.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment, because I had a lot of pressure from people around me saying, why would you turn down a 4-year job offer? Like a 4-year university job offer, that's unheard of. But even though it was a low cost of living area, I feel like the salary they were asking a lot of anyone who would take a job there. It was a pay cut for me. And it was a very, very small department. I could tell that there was a lot of work that perhaps would fall on just the 3 or 4 of us. Not that that doesn't happen in every department, but I think I don't know, I felt like it would have been a position that people would have been taken advantage of. And I know we're willing to make huge sacrifices, but it probably would have been too much. On the other hand, I think that we have flexibility, and yes, a lot of us have families or financial restraints, but you can move. People do move around a lot in academia. If you're not happy in the position you've chosen, people reapply before and after tenure. So that's something kind of interesting about the flexibility that we have in our jobs. We have flexibility during the week, perhaps when we host office hours or when we are actually on campus. And we also have flexibility with where we live every 2 to 5 years, I guess. Yeah, and it is a little scary, but you have to be, I think, experimental with our research and with where we apply and take jobs.
Yeah, LuElla, I'll just say that in some ways, this discussion, especially this last part, really comes back to your opening question about how has the pandemic changed things? Because really, right, like this last year and a half has forced so much introspection and reevaluation, right, of things that matter, priorities, and certainly what the future is going to look like, right? So it is a really nice way to kind of round it out. And I mean, I agree with Luis. There's it's clearly where it's headed to, like these discussions, these trends.
All right, so I think we have about another minute or so. Did anyone want to make any final remarks before we close out our job market roundtable?
Ever so briefly, I just want to say to anyone who might be watching this after the fact, I'm easy to find on UGA English Department website. If ever you want to continue a conversation about job search and strategy, just reach out, send me an email, but I'd be happy to do some of the work we could do if this were a real normal real life conference and we could talk before or after. But I want to make myself available to anyone who might be watching this who could benefit from a conversation. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, same here. I'm easily accessible via email at csulb.edu. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions, especially as people are making their way into the academy or not.
Yeah, and if anybody was got their PhD at a four-year school and they think maybe they want to work at a community college, research isn't where it's at for them, I'm happy to talk about that transition and what it's been like for me.
Oh, can I add one thing? I'm sorry, but I just wanted to say one thing that was kind of unique to my situation, but I don't think is necessarily unique moving forward. I have a PhD in English, and when I went on the market, I went to, I applied at different traditional English departments, but also ethnic studies, et cetera. I ended up in a job in women's studies that I was at for 15 years in that department. And then I moved, and I am now in Chicano Latino studies for the last 5. So that's another thing. If there's audience members that are thinking about how to diversify themselves or whether or not they should, or again, sort of thinking about how they want to go through their professional life in different places, that's something else I'd be happy to talk about. So
Right, and just to follow up on Monica's point, if anyone does want to contact me, I'm at Lane Community College, and I'm happy to talk about what it's like being at our college, what it's like being at a 2-year college, and also the possibilities for maintaining a modest research agenda while you are teaching at a 2-year school. That is a possibility. So I'd be happy to talk about that with you as well.
Similarly, I'm open to correspond with anyone who has any questions, particularly if you're interested in talking about changing careers, which I have now done twice, and thinking about how do you stay in what you're doing, or how do you move on from there. So I'd be more than happy to correspond with you if that's something that you're interested in.
So I will thank you all again. And I want to say that you have just not only met, but far exceeded my expectations for what this job market roundtable was going to be today. I am grateful for this. I feel, as I mentioned after the remarks, heartened by this, and I imagine that a lot of our job seekers will as well. And I think that, like, the word of the day that I hope that they take away is the liberating, right? That they should be liberated and not feel wholly constricted, right? Because I feel so often as we are talking about the job market, it can feel as if, right, there isn't this bounty, right? That is this wholly constricting, right? But you have these wonderful panelists who want to help you, and there is a lot of opportunity. So please reach out to them. You can reach out to me. I'm easily accessible as well. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.